that countries which were fast in moving in these technologies benefited most from these productivity gains, benefited also from employment. But on the other hand, there is also a feature which I would argue that destructive creation is also part of the picture. And it is certainly a picture whereby the short-term employment creation of the free riding, of the various other parts in which new benefits have been generated by providing new modes in the network, for instance, might well have long-term negative employment implications, benefiting a few at the expense of many. Let me come to my third area on shifting wealth. Well, I think this is in line with what was said before. We really are confronted here with, to some extent, a dramatic shift. I think the shift here at the global level between North and South is very different today from what it was in the past. And I still think, again, that from a historical perspective, we insufficiently recognize to what extent the past, and in particular this past till 1973, was a process of divergence. Historically, of course, very much based on the rebuilding after the Second World War, which had a very strong national focus on the way all the things we talked about in terms of industrial policies by definition were policies aimed at national competitiveness. How could we re-establish performance at the national level? And so in this phase, with colonialism, of course, you had a phase by which, to some extent, the rich recovered, and in particular Japan, Germany, and many other parts of the world started to have a very high growth path in after the Second World War. And of course, the colonial dimension should not be forgotten in that picture. So that basically in 73, you had the highest inequality at the world level ever, would be my claim. I would really claim that in as far as we are children of the late 60s and 70s, it's of course something we have carried with us. And it is that inequality, that dramatic inequality at the global level, which is really striking, particularly if you look here on the base of the Madison data, the data from Deepak Nair, you see here that in 80-20, these countries, say the large countries, represented more or less half of the world income, which of course very much concentrated in China and India, but that today, if you look at 73, you see that, for instance, the percentage of the world population of these countries was 42%, and you look in 73, the total percentage of world income was 12.5%, which is incredible. It's incredible in terms of global inequality. And I still think that in this sense, what you witness, I mean, if you add the figures here for 2011 or 2012, it would be even more striking. What you witness is to some extent a return to normal, to the period before the Industrial Revolution, before the period of the dramatic divergence in growth. So, but to come back to this, Chris has always been at pains to highlight that this incredible geographical inequality was something which was something whereby the information communication technology could make a difference. And I think this is also where the combination, of course, with what Carlotta brought up, and where, of course, in the early stage could also contribute in terms of the technological leapfrogging, and the idea is that there were opportunities, windows of opportunities for emerging countries to enter into these new social, economic, technological paradigms was also something which Chris adhere to very much. And in this sense, the issue of this shifting world, whereby we are today confronted with, in addition, of course, the social media of global aspirations of anybody, any youngster in the world, between aspirations in terms of work, in terms of the quality of his life, in terms of income, in terms of consumption, is of course what is driving, of course, these shifts occurring in wealth, etc. I won't go into this with, of course, this is the picture, and of course this picture is of course very misleading, but it's still the picture as the OECD itself is now starting to shift its attention. You could say the OECD is following, the countries is basically following the impact it doesn't have on shifting to the countries where the most interesting features are occurring. So from a limited convergence period, we have now a converging world in the OECD terms, etc., with much larger countries converging in the definitions of the OECD. And of course, there is the issue about the aging, there is the issue about the public debt, the fiscal dimensions which were mentioned here also in the introduction here, and the impact these fiscal dimensions, Erkan mentioned it in the introduction, are having on the countries. And the differences in terms of public debt dynamics are of course striking if you look at the difference between advanced economies and emerging and developing. What does this mean for us as innovation scholars? This is the Globelics dimension. This is basically the core of Globelics, and I therefore will not say too much about this. Let me highlight my own view, which is very closely associated with this destructive creation argument. I would argue that innovation studies have been trapped, so to say, within this vision of focusing very much on the tip of the income pyramid. And I think this is in the logic, of course, of the easy way in which firms, as I try to highlight with this model of Calvano, will focus very much on high quality features which they can add to the consumption goods, destroying at the same time the existing stock of capital, of consumption goods. And this leads you this kind of virtuous circle, of course, for the firms successful in doing so, but ultimately it is an unsustainable process ecologically, but also in terms of the global dimension. Because basically what it leads you to is that the growth perspectives which these large firms have is very fastly eroded by focusing on the high income proportions of your societies, and particularly in emerging countries. This is one of the dynamics, are these high income groups. And of course, you can satisfy their consumption needs, etc. in the first stage, but very quickly you run out of steam. What we do not have in the innovation dimension is the fourth T model at the global level. We do not have the model which is really entering into the middle classes, into the other part of society. And that is basically what we are witnessing today, the search on the part of the business community in the absence of Keynesian global redistribution policies for long tails everywhere, not just in this high income element with respect. And this is quickly what I think where Globelics, of course, has its potential in terms of innovation for development. You could argue that research will still be globally driven, but that what you will witness continuously is a search for these new areas of capturing new markets where the innovation characteristics are very, very different from what the research laboratories, and particularly in the product innovation side, one is looking for. So I've mentioned this at various occasions here also in previous Globelics conferences. I won't repeat this, but ultimately, this is the most interesting feature. It is that you see that with David Cripps on National Institute of Health study on what the North can learn from the South in terms of National Institute. Because with rising costs in health, with operations which are 80% in many cases not needed, with visits from patients which are just for control functions which could be done in much more different organizational ways, the search is on for much cheaper ways in which one can actually serve the same way, in the same way the patient, but with a different health model than what we developed in the North. So the search is on continuously on these insights in global models, covering not just each time the tip of the income pyramid, but with a much broader focus. My line on this is very much that this is closely associated with the interesting feature of emerging and developing countries, which is surprising maybe, the lack of infrastructure. It is that you are forced to autonomy. No surprise that mobile phones were so popular and are so popular in a framework where you do not have the landline infrastructure which is everywhere available. No surprise that electricity grids are much less, it's much more difficult in the North to come up with alternative ecological systems of electricity provision in a decentralized way when you have continuously an existing sophisticated grid system. You might use the grid for coverage and for coverage of electricity, but you basically continue to confront it between autonomy and infrastructure. And in this sense, autonomy, the unwired, you could say unwired Globelics or unwired innovation is really in this sense one of the biggest challenges in all these high quality infrastructures where they were developed in the highly developed countries, existing and basically locking in the innovation system in terms of the connection each time to these infrastructure systems. You could go over this and you could each time see that autonomy means freedom of movement. The success of the mobile, the success of local electricity provision is the freedom of movement, the freedom of the local community. And that is basically something which is the novelty in many of these innovation areas where we basically need. So I have to go fast now because even despite Bengt-Åke's gentle commitment to give me more minutes, I'm running out of time. I think that my conclusions are clear. We are witnessing today an emerging innovation development paradigm, because Freeman is no longer there to help us in highlighting the features of those. I think we as grandchildren are there basically to elaborate on some of those ideas. I've given you a couple of examples, etc. Let me conclude on a couple of Freeman reflections, which I think have not been sufficiently put the attention to, at least in his work. I know that Carlotta made a lot of emphasis on this, but I still think it's important for our community. Commitment to optimism as antidote against policy cynicism. Addressing and relentlessly searching for solutions to the intricate and complex interdisciplinary international topics we as Globelics community study and Freeman wrote about. I think this is for me an essential feature, that is that cynicism is all over the place. And of course, as academics, we live of cynical reflections on each other's work. This is the way of the critical interactions. But I think the optimism in terms of trying to contribute, to say how one can go further then, and what is then the contribution in finding solutions to the problem one is confronted with, I think should be what our community pulls together. Secondly, and this might be, I'm saying this might be surprising coming from somebody like myself, heavily involved in a more econometric work, or at least in psychometric and data analysis, is that we need to broaden our analysis going way beyond economics or microeconometrics. In many areas of social sciences, and I'm thinking here particularly of the work of Esther Duflo and the laboratory experiments in social policies, in labor economics, in labor policies, we have many opportunities with large data sets available for running experiments as scientific experiments, for pilot programs, for selected evaluation, for randomization. This is the big breakthrough, the social sciences becoming really scientific. And of course, while I very much welcome this, because you can see that, for instance, in labor policy and social policy, you really get fascinating insights into the working of particular policy proposals as opposed to other proposals. I would still warn that our area is a very peculiar area. And that in our area, with so many externalities, with so many spillovers, and I thank, of course, this comes to Bart Verspagen, with whom I'm in a committee for on the value of research for the Dutch Academy of Sciences, where basically the microeconometric and data-based advice you get in these areas really ignore, in the most dramatic way, the complexities, the intricacies of many of these features. And it explains, and you see this very much in the papers discussed here at Globelics, the problems. That is that there is a temptation to go in that direction, which is welcome, which I think advances our area, but the danger is continuously that we go beyond that area and that we present this to policymakers as the policy handbook, which they just have to follow with all the insights. Third and finally, and of course this is something which I could not talk about here, but Chris had much and much more to offer than what I talked here about, and particularly much more beyond economics. I can't resist to give you a relatively long quote from the work he wrote in '84 for the Department of Philosophy at Maastricht University in Canada, just to show you that Chris indeed made presentations to totally different fields, etc., highlighting the importance for the multidisciplinary nature of our community. And just, if you read this, you just wonder what has changed with Mr. Dennis Snowden, with NSA, with all the other areas. So Freeman, on the book of Orwell, which was written in 1948, which was of course called 1984. And in '84 in Britain there were of course many people writing about Orwell's 1984. And Chris also wrote about Orwell's 1984. And this is just an extract from what he wrote there. The compelling power of the book of Orwell 1984 derives from the fact that the political and military scenario published in 1948 is close enough to what was and is actually happening in the world, as to make the nightmare in many respects a highly realistic one. The book is rarely classed as science fiction, and rightly so. Although it is in the form of a novel, it is much closer to the world futures debate and to contemporary political discussions than it is to the literature of science fiction. Orwell does not speculate about the long-term consequence of new developments in genetics or about exploration of outer space, as others did. He does, however, introduce technology into his book, and it plays an important part in his nightmare. But it is a technology which is not far removed from that which was actually available in 1948. Nuclear weapons, electronic mass communication, monitoring and information systems, and technologies of torture and repression. This again gives the novel far more power in terms of its credibility than the more speculative works of science fiction. It is concerned with the actual and potential applications of what is already here on this planet, rather than what might happen in the long-term future or in outer space. 1984 could be described as a work of technology fiction, but never of science fiction. The truly original and important contribution of Orwell lies in the perception of the consequences of this institutionalized superpower conflict for the internal politics of the superpowers themselves, as well as for every other country. Truth was now too important to be left to independent scholars, writers, or scientists, or to the independent judgment of citizens. It had to be the concern of officials in a ministry and in a governing party, controlling the dissemination of an official version and using the new and extremely powerful electronic media, both to reinforce the message and to keep the record straight. The Ministry of Truth, in the book, of course, of Orwell, is the key governmental institution in Airstrip 1. Especially important was Orwell's deep-going recognition that unrestrained exercise of power corrupts not only the rulers, but also the ruled, and that the power itself depends upon that corruption. People who are repressed socially, economically, and sexually, and who feel a great sense of insecurity, can easily embrace creeds of violent nationalism, racialism, and leader worship. People who have never experienced responsible autonomy, either as children or as adults, can easily identify with the violent exercise of arbitrary power against real or imaginary scapegoats. And what is more, they can willingly submit to this power. Thank you.